Simone Graves was 36 years old the night her husband of 8 years stood in their own doorway, pointed a finger at her chest, and told her to get out of his house. To look at her, you would not have guessed much. She drove a gray Civic with a cracked dashboard vent she had never bothered to replace. She wore the same 3 pairs of work shoes in rotation and carried her lunch in a cloth bag her mother had sewn. Her husband, Terrence Graves, had introduced her at his company's annual dinner 3 years running as my wife Simone, and then moved on to the next conversation, and she had stood beside him holding her glass and smiling with the particular patience of a woman who has learned to measure what she is seeing. He threw her out on a Thursday in March. He had accused her, loudly and without evidence, of involving his younger brother Victor in their private affairs. He said she had gone behind his back. He said she had shown Victor things she had no right to show. He said the words with the fury of a man who had been caught doing something and needed the accusation to land before the truth did. She left without raising her voice. She took her car, her laptop bag, and the small fireproof document box she had kept in the back of the bedroom closet for 4 years. That box contained $247,000 in notarized financial records he had no idea she had compiled. What Terrence did not know, and what his girlfriend Paige Holloway did not know either, was what was sitting in that document box, and whose name was on the commercial lease 2 miles from the house he had just thrown her out of. 6 months later, he called her phone 84 times in a single weekend. She answered none of them. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The hum of the industrial sewing machines was the sound Simone had grown up with. Her mother had run a small alterations shop out of the back of a dry goods store in West Atlanta for 22 years. And the rhythm of those machines had been the background noise of Simone's entire childhood. Steady and purposeful, the sound of a woman making something from raw material that other people had discarded or overlooked. Simone had learned to sew before she learned to drive. She had also learned, from watching her mother, that a seam done right was invisible. The work was in the structure, not the surface. She was a textile production manager. She had spent 12 years overseeing manufacturing contracts for a mid-size apparel company headquartered in Atlanta. And she was very good at it because she understood how things were made from the inside out, which fabrics would hold under stress and which would fray at the first pull, which contracts would survive scrutiny, and which had been drafted to look clean while hiding a frayed edge somewhere in the middle. Her grandfather, who had built furniture in a workshop behind his house in Decatur until he was 81 years old, had told her once while she was watching him sand a cabinet door, "Simone, the finish is what people see, but it's the joinery that decides whether the thing holds." He had not been talking about furniture. She had understood that even then. She had met Terrence at a mutual friend's cookout in the summer of their 28th year. He was a commercial real estate broker, well-dressed and well-spoken, the kind of man who knew how to be present in a room without crowding it. He had asked her questions about her work with genuine curiosity, or what she had at the time believed was genuine curiosity, and she had found that quality rare enough to be worth her attention. They had dated for 2 years and married in a ceremony at her grandfather's church, and for the first 3 years of the marriage she had not had cause to examine the joinery very carefully. The trouble had arrived, as it often did, not as a single moment but as a pattern she assembled over time. Terrence's brother Victor was 4 years younger and worked in residential property management. He was a quiet man who had always treated Simone with a straightforward decency that she had appreciated without reading too much into it. What she had noticed over the previous year was that Victor had begun finding reasons to speak with her privately. A question about a contractor referral. A comment about Thanksgiving that didn't quite connect to Thanksgiving. A text one Sunday evening that said simply, "I hope you're doing okay," which was not how Victor texted. She had noted each exchange without acting on it, the way she noted a fabric that was running slightly off grain on the inspection table, not enough to pull yet, but enough to watch. The sign that finally gave the pattern a shape was a receipt. She had found it in the side pocket of Terrence's dry cleaning, a dinner receipt from a restaurant in Buckhead she had never been to with him. For 2 people, on a Tuesday evening when he had told her he was at a client presentation in Dunwoody. The receipt was dated 4 months prior. She set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for 30 seconds. Then she photographed it and put it back in the pocket exactly as she had found it, and hung the dry cleaning in the closet. She was watching. The discovery did not unfold through a phone or a locked drawer. It unfolded through the doorbell camera she had installed 18 months earlier, after a package had gone missing from the front porch, and which Terrence had glanced at and never mentioned again. She had not gone looking for what the camera showed her. She had been reviewing footage from a Tuesday afternoon to confirm a delivery had arrived, and what she found instead, in the timestamp just before the delivery van, was Terrence's car pulling into the driveway at 11:43 in the morning. She had been at a factory audit in Marietta until 3. He had told her that morning he was in client meetings until 5. She watched the footage for 12 minutes. A woman in a dark coat arrived in a separate car 9 minutes after Terrence. They did not knock. Terrence let her in with his own key. Her face remained perfectly calm. She downloaded the footage to her laptop and titled the file by date. Then she went back through the previous 16 months of recordings, methodically, 2 weeks at a time, the way she reviewed a production run for defects, starting at the beginning and not skipping anything. She did not rush. She was not looking for a feeling. She was building a record. What she found was a pattern that had been running for 14 months. The woman arrived on Tuesdays and occasionally Thursdays when Simone was confirmed to be away for work. Terrence's car was always in the driveway first. The visits ran between 90 minutes and 3 hours. There were 26 documented instances across the 14-month window. She cross-referenced the dates against Terrence's calendar, which she still had access to through the shared household account. Every visit aligned with a client meeting, a site visit, or a conference that had appeared on his calendar and then silently disappeared from it by the following day. He had been editing his own schedule after the fact. It was meticulous, and it had almost worked. She did not confront him. She was a production manager. You did not halt a line based on a single defect reading. You documented, you traced the source, and you built a case that could not be argued with. She identified the woman through the car's registration, which her attorney would later confirm was registered to Paige Holloway, a 31-year-old marketing consultant who had worked with Terrence's brokerage firm on 2 commercial listings in the previous year. She opened a folder on her desktop. She named it Production Log. She had always found that clear labels were the most honest kind. She made one phone call that evening, sitting in her car in the parking lot of the factory she managed. The engine off, the Atlanta evening settling in around her. She called Victor. When you move too early, you get a lie. When you wait, you get the truth. Victor had known for 3 months. This was the thing Simone had not been certain of until he said it, quietly and without any apparent pleasure, sitting across from her at a table in a coffee shop off Memorial Drive. He had found out when Paige Holloway had called Terrence from an unknown number while Victor was in the passenger seat of Terrence's car, and Terrence had answered it without checking who was calling, and then pulled over and asked Victor to wait outside. Victor had waited outside. He had heard enough through the window. He had been trying to tell Simone without telling her, which was the source of the careful, sideways texts she had noted. He was not a man built for deception in either direction, and the situation had been wearing on him visibly. He handed her a folded piece of paper across the table. It was a printed screenshot of a text conversation between Terrence and Paige from 4 months prior, in which Terrence referred to the house, meaning the house he shared with Simone, as soon to be just mine again, and in which Paige had responded with a timeline question, and Terrence had written, "Give me 8 months." Victor said, "I'm sorry I didn't find a cleaner way to do this." Simone folded the paper and placed it in the document box she had brought to the meeting. "You did the right thing," she said. She drove from that coffee shop directly to the office of Phyllis Okafor, a family law attorney in Sandy Springs, whose name had been on a list Simone had made 14 months earlier and updated monthly since. Phyllis was 58 years old, had practiced family law in Georgia for 26 years, and had the particular economy of motion that came from having sat across from too many people who had waited too long to make this appointment. Phyllis reviewed the production log folder on Simone's laptop, the doorbell footage timestamps, the text screenshot, and the financial records from the fireproof box, without speaking for 19 minutes. Then she closed the laptop and said, "In Georgia, documented marital misconduct affects equitable distribution. What you have here is not a feeling or a suspicion. It is a chronological record with corroboration. You have done the work most clients wait to do until it is no longer useful to do it." Simone said, "I've been managing production timelines for 12 years. I know how to document a run." Phyllis looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "He made a significant error when he threw you out of that house without a legal instrument behind him. The house is jointly titled. His accusation, without grounds, and your departure under those circumstances actually works in your favor. The accusation about Victor, it turned out, was not the irrational outburst it had appeared to be. Terrence had known Victor had spoken to Simone. What he had not known was how much she already had before Victor said a word. He had thrown her out to create distance and buy time, believing that separating her from the house and from her access to shared records would slow whatever she was building. He had not known about the document box. He had not known about the commercial lease. He had not known that Simone had spent 4 years quietly building a production consulting firm registered under her grandmother's maiden name, which held 3 active apparel manufacturing contracts and had generated $340,000 in revenue in the previous calendar year, none of it commingled with marital assets. He had thrown her out of a house, not out of a life. Freedom was the real currency. By the end of the first week, she was staying in the furnished apartment above the consulting office she had built and said nothing about, which was comfortable because she had furnished it herself and had always known precisely what she needed without requiring anyone else's input. She slept without difficulty. She worked without interruption. She filed the petition for divorce on a Monday morning, and Phyllis filed the asset disclosure the same afternoon, which listed, among Simone's documented premarital and separately held assets, the consulting firm, its contracts, and its 4-year revenue history. Terrence received the disclosure on a Wednesday. Phyllis's assistant reported that his attorney had called within 2 hours of receipt, asking for a clarification call, which was attorney language for "we did not know about this." 2 days later, Phyllis surfaced the counter-evidence that closed the remaining questions. Terrence had, in the previous 14 months, charged $58,000 in personal and undisclosed expenses to the joint home equity line of credit. Restaurant meals, hotel stays, a piece of jewelry purchased in November from a jeweler in Buckhead that Simone had not received, and 4 separate transfers to a personal account in his name alone. The charges had been made in small enough amounts to avoid triggering a notification threshold, but they accumulated with the particular clarity of a production defect that has been occurring on every third unit for over a year. She added the figures to the production log. She noted each one without expression, the way she noted a variance on a fabric test report. Documentation was not personal. It was professional. It was simply the record of what had actually occurred. The night before the mediation, Terence called her. She did not answer. He left a message that said he thought they should talk before things went further, that he had made mistakes and that he wanted to be reasonable. His voice had the careful modulation of a man who had been coached on what to say. She listened to the message once. She saved it to the production log folder. Then, she turned the phone face down on the desk beside her grandmother's sewing box, which she had brought from storage when she moved into the apartment, and went back to reviewing the next morning's documents. Tools were meant to work, not shine. The mediation was held in Phyllis's conference room on a Friday morning in September, 8 weeks after Terence had stood in the doorway of the house they shared and told Simone to leave. He arrived with his attorney and a posture that had compressed itself over the previous weeks from the tall certainty he had worn the night of the accusation into something considerably more careful. Paige Holloway was not present, which was, again, the correct choice. Victor sat quietly at the far end of the table at Simone's request, not as a witness in any formal capacity, but because she had felt it was right that the person who had chosen honesty when it cost him something should be present when the honesty produced its result. Phyllis laid out the materials in 3 clean rows, the doorbell footage timestamps, and their correlation to the deleted calendar entries. The $58,000 in unauthorized home equity charges, itemized and sourced. The text conversation between Terence and Paige with the 8-month timeline. And, placed last and separately, the full financial disclosure of the consulting firm, its contracts, and its 4-year revenue history. Terence's attorney reviewed the equity charge itemization first. He wrote a note and passed it to Terence, who read it with the expression of a man recalculating a number he had been certain of and finding it significantly wrong. Terence's attorney then reviewed the consulting firm disclosure. He asked for a brief recess. Phyllis said, of course. When they returned, Terence looked across the table at Simone and said, in a voice from which all the performance had finally drained, "I didn't know about the firm." "I know," she said. He said, "I want to resolve this without making it worse." She considered him for a moment. She thought about 14 months of Tuesday visits, and the jeweler in Buckhead, and the night he had pointed at her chest in their doorway and told her to leave, and the careful way he had said "my wife Simone" at his company dinners before moving immediately to the next conversation. She said, "You made 8 months of plans, Terence. I made 4 years of them. That's the difference between where we are sitting." She placed the proposed settlement terms in front of him. The return of the full equity line balance with documented interest, the award of her separately held marital contribution from the joint savings, no claim against the consulting firm, which had been built entirely outside the marital estate and would remain so, and a clause, drafted by Phyllis with particular care, that any public misrepresentation of the circumstances of the separation, including the unfounded accusation that had preceded her removal from the house, would constitute a breach carrying specific financial consequence. He signed in under 2 hours. His attorney gathered the papers with the economy of motion that belonged to a man who wanted to be finished with a room. Simone stood, closed her portfolio, and nodded once across the table at Victor, who nodded back. She picked up the document box, which had started all of this, in the sense that its existence had made all of this possible, and she walked out of the conference room and down the hall and into an Atlanta afternoon that was bright and warm and entirely, unambiguously, hers. She did not look back. 6 months later, from what she understood through a former colleague who still worked adjacent to Terrence's industry, he had lost 2 major commercial listings after a client conducted a background check and the settlement clause notations appeared. His brokerage firm had reassigned his accounts. Paige Holloway had ended the relationship within weeks of the mediation. Victor had not spoken to his brother since the Friday of the signing and had told their mother why, which meant their mother had not spoken to him either. The house had gone on the market and sold below asking. She heard all of this the way she heard most things that no longer required her active attention, briefly, without lingering. And then, she moved on. The 84 calls had come on a Saturday and Sunday in late September, beginning the morning after the settlement was finalized and his attorney had confirmed what the documents contained. She had been at the consulting office reviewing a new contract when the phone began. She counted the calls over the 2 days, not because the number mattered, but because it told her something precise about the distance between what he had expected and what he had found. She did not answer a single one. She had learned, from her grandfather sanding that cabinet door in Decatur, that you did not revisit a finished joint. You checked it once, you verified it was sound, and then you moved forward to the next piece of work. 9 months later, Simone sat at the long work table in the consulting office she had built and not announced. Running her hands along a bolt of raw linen she was considering for a new client's sample production run. The late afternoon came through the industrial windows at the angle she had planned for when she selected the space, low and even. The kind of light that showed texture honestly and did not flatter what was not there. Andre Tillman, a structural engineer she had met at a manufacturing trade conference in the spring, sat at the other end of the table reviewing a set of building specifications for a facility expansion she was consulting on. He was a quiet man who worked with the same focused patience she brought to her own work, and who had, when he first asked her to dinner, said simply that he had noticed how she listened when other people were speaking, and that it seemed like a rare quality worth knowing better. She had appreciated the precision of that observation. Her consulting firm had signed 2 new contracts in the previous quarter, bringing its active portfolio to 5 clients and its annualized revenue to just over $490,000. She had hired a production coordinator in the spring and was meeting with a second candidate the following week. The work was expanding at the rate she had planned for, neither faster nor slower, because she had always believed that growth not built on verified foundation was not growth but risk wearing a promising face. The sewing box her grandmother had made sat on the shelf above the work table, its wood worn smooth at the corners from years of handling. Inside it, among the bobbins and the seam rippers and the chalk markers, was a small piece of paper her grandfather had pressed into her hand at her wedding, which she had found that evening in the pocket of her dress and read only once, and then kept. It said, in his careful print, "The joinery decides whether the thing holds. Make sure of the joinery." She had been sure of it. She pressed her palm flat against the linen and felt the weight of the weave, even and honest, and exactly what it had been represented to be. She had built everything worth keeping. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.